You are here on this Sunday, which is our launch Sunday for a 2-year spiritual growth campaign called Poured Out. What we're going to be talking about over the next 4 weekends is how you can be a part of personal spiritual growth. Above everything, the deliverable is that you and I would take steps of growth in our own personal spiritual life. And the overflow of that will benefit to our congregation and to the community at large. So let me invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28, we'll look at verses 18 to 20, Jesus' great commission to the church, to his people. As you're turning to Matthew chapter 28, let me just remind you how you came to be sitting here in this building on Sunday morning. 21 years ago, March 1st, Vicki and I left our hometown of Mishawaka, Indiana. We had left with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. We left 6 weeks after we buried my mother, who had lived with us during the tail end of her illness. We moved to a place that I had never been before, where we knew exactly no one. I took a 25% cut in pay and doubled the price of our housing expenses. This made no sense whatsoever. Why would you do that? The answer is because God had called me and has continually called me to pastor a church. And I had spent about 8 years as an associate pastor, and I had grown as far as I was going to grow in that setting. And that calling on my life drove us to take change and to take risk. I will say to you that as a congregation, we are in exactly the same place today. Vicki and I have lived and enjoyed a 21-year legacy of God blessing those steps of risk, embracing that change in the lives of so many people around us. We have not only been blessed, but we have tried to be a blessing to others. And our congregation today is at a place where our next step of growth is going to require that we embrace change, that we take risks. The reason for that is because the purpose, the calling on this church is not to make you comfortable. And all God's people said. Amen. The calling of this church is very clear. God has called us to make, to baptize, and to teach disciples. So right out of the gate, let me clarify what this entire 2-year campaign and this 4-week kickoff campaign introduction is all about. Our purpose as a congregation, our purpose is to make, baptize, and teach disciples. Let me read to you from Matthew chapter 28. Where is it that we embrace this purpose? Where did that come from? And it came from the Lord Jesus himself, who gathered his closest followers together after his crucifixion, after his resurrection. He appeared to them. He gave them all the testimony that God had raised him from the dead, and then he sent us on a mission. This is what, he said as he began to ascend into heaven, this is what I want you to be about until I return. And it's Matthew 28, verse 17. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That, by the way, is a good promise. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. Little definition. As you are going, make disciples. Disciples, a follower. You, Jesus said, have become followers of me. You've seen my life. You watched my death. You've experienced the power of my resurrection. Now, go share that message with others. Make a disciple. As you're going, your day-to-day getting up, going to work, living your life, engaging with your neighbors, playing your sports, enjoying your hobbies, all that you do, as you're going, part of that purpose is make disciples. For some of us, a very few of us, that going entails what Vicki and I did years ago, which is responding to a call, full-time ministry, and leaving that which you may know and love and be comfortable with in order to fulfill the call. For most people, it's simply a matter of remembering where God has placed you. Your goal, your desire, your purpose is to help make followers, make disciples of Jesus Christ. And then he gives this further command. So once someone has come to that place of trust in Christ, they've crossed that line of faith. and they're believers, they're followers, then the church has a responsibility. Make disciples of all nations. By the way, we don't limit who ethnically or linguistically can be a part of our church. This is God's calling from the very beginning. Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So that last weekend, 9 who were baptized, testifying that God has done a work in their life, and they want others to see that. This is why we do that. This is in fulfillment of what God has called us to do, our purpose. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. So then part of that calling is not only make disciples, baptize those who have faith, but then don't just leave them orphans, teach them. And what we're to teach them is very broad, very wide. You teach them all that you've observed. All you've seen Jesus Christ do in your life, begin to teach that. All you've seen God's Word do by way of transformation in your life, begin to teach that. And you have this system, or you have this process of disciples being made, and disciples being baptized, and disciples growing and learning in their faith, and then they go and do the same thing. And this for 2,000 years has been the purpose of the church. This for 16 years has been the purpose of this particular congregation. God has blessed whenever we have done that. Because of what Jesus has done, there is then an expectation on us to respond. Because he has all authority, because he's died, he's risen again, because there's great news to share, go. Make disciples. Baptize them. Teach them. And then the promise, I am with you always, to the very end of the age. There will not be a time when Jesus will not be for this mission. There will never be a time when the church can have a second top priority. God has called us, Jesus has commissioned us to go, to make disciples, and he says, and I'll be with you the whole way. And we have certainly experienced that in the life of our church. The purpose of this church is to make, to baptize, and teach disciples. That's why on April 1st, 2001, 35 of us gathered, began this process. We worked hard together from different backgrounds, and God blessed. That's why in 2005, after 4 years in that old donated building to us over on Route 53 in St. Charles Road, we had a decision to face. We'd filled it up twice, 2 services. It was filled up. No more parking, no more room for people. Does this sound familiar? And so we'd remodeled, taken out walls, expanded as large as we could go. We met with the village officials in Lombard. They said, listen, here's the deal. Given the contours of that land, you can get about 250 people in that building. So you want to be a church of 250, we'll give you the permitting to do that. And I remember, Joel Loss, one of our elders here today, was with us in those days. I remember the conversation our leaders had, and here's what we had no comfort at all with that. We determined that God had called us to greater fruitfulness and faithfulness than that. We didn't want to limit that. And so we sold that building, not having any other place to go. Just sort of stepped out by faith, and that began a remarkable process over just a week's time or less, where we were able to purchase this ground. We moved into the school back over on Pleasant Hill and spent 2 years there as this was built. And I remember walking in here August 10th, 2008. That was our first weekend in the building. I remember walking in, and I remember being so grateful for what God had done, and I remember thinking, how will we ever fill this place up? I think we bought 200 chairs. Actually, we had to rent. We didn't have chairs the first few months here. We rented chairs, but God was faithful. And one of the things I wouldn't have done if I was writing the script of this church is I wouldn't have chosen a year later, in 2009, just as we began to get some momentum in this building, one of our beloved long-term pastors, Pastor Ryan Hall, took a call, and we partnered with him in planting Harvest Bible Chapel down in Palos. He's a good man, gifted man. That church is about 500 people now, just 6 or 7 years into it. And yet our church rallied around and not only sent him and some families off, but we're able to provide financial support during a really tough time in the history of our church. And I've said before, the greatest year of growth in our life of our church was 2010, the year after we did that. And 2011, we added a second service. And 2013, we did the first of about 3 remodels in this building. And Eric and I moved off campus, and the others stayed here, but we created more space. And then in 2015, we added a third service. And you remember all the remodel? How many of you were here for the 50 for Kids remodel down the hallway here? So about half of you. And so we moved all the offices out. We created more children's classroom space, and the children's ministry began to grow. And 2016 and 2017, we began the planning behind the scenes of what's going to be next. How are we going to address this growth? And I'm here to say that 2017, 2018, it's time to build. It's time to move forward. We've done a lot of work, a lot of preparation, and now together we're going to take these steps forward to be able to make this move of growth. And our calling primarily is to help grow as a congregation. So let me be real clear for you. Some of you will have, or maybe most of you have, this little guide, as Pastor Nate talked about. Let me say 3 things so that you know what it is we're calling to you to do and be as part of Poured Out. What are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish with Poured Out? Let me give you the first one is this: work for the health and growth of our church family. Primarily, what we want to see over the next 2 years is maturity and growth in this congregation. As we have seen growth outward, and maybe you want to say we want to have some depth as well. We want people to be equipped to live out their faith. We want people to be a bright light in their communities, in their families, in their neighborhoods, on their jobs, and that's going to demand that we take seriously our responsibility to grow in our faith, make, baptize, and then teach, and we're going to be doing that and aiming for growth and health in this church family over the next 2 years. Secondly, we want to face outward to reach our communities. Very intentional that we are scheduling and funding and financing and planning and putting resources and time and effort and volunteers toward facing outward, toward reaching out in the community. It will do us no good to have a beautiful new facility if we're not facing the community. We need people that will help own that mission to make, baptize, teach disciples. And so we've scheduled 10 outreach events this year. We're looking to quintuple the number of students we reach and children that we're involved with in our student ministry, our children's ministry, and trying to get 1,000 contacts and be able to teach 1,000 students, children this summer, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and call for a response. Every quarter this year, there will be in this building, on a weekend set of services, there will be a clear gospel presentation and a call to response. The first one coming up for you to be a part of is Easter. Make sure you get your family and friends here. We will share the gospel. We will call for people to respond to the gospel. There'll be one in the summer, one late in the spring, in the summer, in the fall, and in the wintertime. We're serious about facing out our student ministries, our adult small groups. All of those things are working hard towards giving the opportunity to look outward and share our faith with the community. Third purpose, the third goal, Poured Out calls us to work for the health and growth of our church family, to face outward to reach our community. Third, to expand our building in order to serve our purposes. We want to expand our building in order to serve our purposes, and that is the reason for the expansion. As we have grown as a congregation, we don't want our shoe to tell us how big the foot can grow, right? We want to make sure that we can provide space for students, space for adults in education, and space for pastoral ministry and staff as well. Can I tell you 2 or 3 stories that recently we've experienced that demonstrate for me the health of our church and the reason why we need to be able to address these needs? Vicki and I were out walking our dog the other night. Warm. It was Wednesday night. It was so warm. Well, all last week. And we were out in front of our house walking the dog, and some neighbors of ours, they live down the street and around the corner, happened to be going by, and we stopped and talked for a little while because, in Chicago, you don't see your neighbors for about 6 months. And they said to me, "Hey, Scott, Crossroads Church, right? Yeah. Hey, so we do business with this guy," and they named him. He said, "Does he go to your church?" Now, when somebody asks you that, you're kind of like, Well, it kind of depends on what the next thing coming out of your mouth is. But since I know this guy, I said, yeah, absolutely. He's terrific, not only a member of our church, but a friend of ours. They said, what an amazing story. We've done business with this guy for years. And when we saw him last, he was just all about telling us how he had trusted Christ at your church, how he was baptized at your church, and how excited he is about what God is doing in his life and his family's life. I said, oh, yeah, he definitely goes to our church. Oh, yeah, I know him well. I love that in the community, and we don't live in Wheaton, we live in West Chicago, right? I love that in the community, word is getting out that there's something about our church that it's about the gospel. I mean, from a very personal standpoint, 2 years ago, for the first time, my nieces and nephews, niece and nephews, came to our summer camp, and they're just going into the middle school and high school years, and they trusted Christ. And I remember baptizing them a couple years ago on Sunday morning. It was such a great time to do that at our camp service. And last weekend, they were back up with us visiting for the weekend, and I will just tell you, they live in a really difficult family situation. Kind of heartbreaking, really. Vicki and I do as much as we can to say, come be here with us, and we want to invest in you. And so we're talking, and the older one, Aaron, who's going in to be a senior year at high school, he came the day later. He couldn't come on Saturday, he came on Sunday. And you tell Aaron, what's going on? Why couldn't you? Yeah, I was making a college visit, and I'm really wrestling with what it would be to be involved in ministry. Man, that's a legacy of the outreach ministry of this church, saying we will reach out even across state lines to share the gospel. Or a few weeks ago, I was with one of our dear members. They've been with us since the beginning. And I took Pastor Chad when he had first started here. And I wanted to introduce him, and also wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing here. I wanted to kind of get in front of the curve with her because she's been so faithful and such a prayer warrior. And I laid it out and talked about that and said, what do you think? I wrote down her response because it was so humbling to me. She said, I have a birthday coming up this fall. I won't tell you the birthday, but I will say it as a 0 on the end, and it will begin her 10th decade of life. She said, I don't know how much time I have left, so I want to tell you something. And at that moment, you lean in, right? Now, Pastor, don't stop reaching out to the new people in order to build a building. Man, I love that. Talk about getting your priorities right. Those people need the Lord. And then she kind of smiled and added, and keep bringing these children to the church. Those are the happiest children I have ever seen. How precious is it that someone who's walked with the Lord for that long, when it comes to the excitement of, no, we're going to be able to build a building, we're going to be able to add parking, but says, hey, Scott, don't give up reaching out to people. Even though she has not had young children in our children's ministry for about, 70 years, bring those kids in. Our purpose is to make and to baptize and to teach disciples. Our purpose is not building a building. Purpose is clarifying when the inevitable challenges and struggles come. And I will say this, when you and I pursue our purpose and we do it well and God blesses, that brings problems. Branch Rickey, great baseball manager and leader, and developed the minor league system back in the day, he wrote this, something I keep under the glass on my desk: problems are the price you pay for progress. And that's true. And so while things have gone well and there's growth and we're focused on purpose in our church, I want to make sure you understand this drive over the next 2 years has been born out of a lot of prayer and thought and wrestling with some real problems we face. One of those, it seems like a minor one, but it's pretty practical, is the issue of parking. And so thank God we've had a mild winter. We can park on the grass, and so many of you park out in the back here, and so many of the folks in the parking lot, when they're doing parking lot attending, and they're saying, all right, now our lot is filled, but if you'll turn back out, and you'll turn right, and you'll turn right again, and then the third driveway, turn right again, and then don't park in that driveway, go through 2 other parking lots, and eventually you'll get back here. Now, if I'm a visitor, I say, forget this, I'm going to go to a church that's simpler. My response is, listen, honestly, Crossroads is a church for smart people. If you can't figure it out, go to Wheaton Bible. Right? Hey, I'm just saying, that's a great church, so. But we've got to deal with this. We've got to be able to handle the issue of parking. One of the things that we actually are concerned about is when people do leave our property to do that, there's always the risk of getting back out on streets and fighting your way around. So we're going to address that issue through this process. You guys are still thinking about that, aren't you? All right, 11 o'clock. Should I say college church at 11 o'clock? Would that be better? I can't. I don't write this stuff. Sometimes it just happens. So we want We want to deal also with the challenge of some education. I was here Wednesday night for Awana. I love that ministry. So many students, children, that's 3-year-olds up through 5th grade that are hearing the Word of God. I was an Awana kid. I mean, God really did a work in my life back in those days. And I'm walking through, visiting the classrooms, disturbing the teachers and greeting the kids, things I'm good at. I noticed there were 3 tables set up in the hallway, one down here and a couple down at the other end. And I asked somebody, why are there tables with all these little chairs set up in the hallway? They said, well, we don't have enough classroom space for the kids. And so we just teach them. They do their workbooks out in the hallways. I love that. But I also love solving problems like that. Or the students that last night were staying overnight, studying and building relationships and learning how to disciple now, learning how to grow and serve. And this weekend, they're serving all weekend long. And let's get them a place that's theirs. Every room in this building is used for multiple purposes. We'd love to be able to get our student ministry some space that they can identify as theirs and invite their family and friends and their neighbors to hang out to as well. And from a kind of a personal standpoint, maybe it seems a little selfish, but there's a practical part of it too. I've been off campus now going on 4 years. I don't mind that. In fact, at times it can be very quiet, but from a practical standpoint, I love the chance to pray with folks after the service, often before, at the end of, in between, and after the second service. I am talking or praying with people. The problem is there's nowhere to do that in this building. And so what I've taken to doing more and more, if I'm going to tell you this secret, it's going to let my secret out, but more and more I go into the nursery and I meet with people there. It's like one of the few quiet places to do that. I think it would be really a benefit and a blessing to be able to have a place and say, you know what, if we want to follow up some more, why don't you come back to the office? Or why don't we go to a conference room and why don't we talk about this and pray about this, see if we can't map out a way forward. Those are things, leaving aside the energy that our staff brings by being on campus, that will be addressed in this process. I will say, having dealt with all this, it's time to get going on this. Now, let me, real quick, and I'm going to get a little bit of the details, just so you understand how this is going to work. This week, much more big picture. In the coming weeks, we'll deal with some of the details, in particular next week and the week after that, so the next 2 weeks. And then our 4th week is going to be, again, a real call to commit, really asking you to embrace this. So by way of detail, though, let me say a couple of things, or 3 things I should say. How did we get to this place? In other words, how is it that I'm standing up here challenging you to say, hey, let's be a part of this Poured Out campaign? And so here's what's happened behind the scenes. And you have had a big part in that with your input. First of all, we have been thorough in our planning. Okay? How do we decide this path forward? We have been very thorough on our planning. How many of you were here December of 2014 when we took the survey? How many of you were involved in our church then? Okay, so some of you, all right. And so about 100 families were interviewed and processed and process is like lunch meat. I don't want to process you, but went through the question and answer process is what I meant to say. And so we got all that information, and that really has largely laid the outlines and the boundaries of where we've gone. And so we've been thorough in our planning. Secondly, we've been cautious with debt. We've been very careful about that, and so all we've done to this point is pay down our debt. You look at the numbers when you get a chance to do that, you'll see that this does not involve new debt. In fact, as we hit our marks and reach our goals, we will, and this has been my goal all along, we will come out the end of this in better financial shape now in 2 years than we are now. That also, by the way, enables us to get to the building of the auditorium that much quicker by being healthy financially. That we've been careful with that. And 3, we have been intentional in waiting this long. We've been intentional in waiting this long. Some of you say, hey, Scott, we heard about maybe buying all the property or some of the property next door. Listen, I have made myself such a nuisance to the neighbors that some of them don't want to meet with me anymore. But that is not going to be an opportunity right now. Now, down the road, I think it probably will. Some of you have heard us talk about maybe buying the office space we rent. And everybody is glad we decided not to buy the office space we rent, right? But we've been intentional in waiting. We've zigged and zagged a little bit, but we've been very clear we haven't not thought of something. We've tried to be very careful and thoughtful as we move through this process. Ultimately, what we want to build is an auditorium. We've been setting up, tearing down chairs for 16 years. We'll probably have to do it for a few more. I am so grateful for those that get here early and stay late to do that. Ultimately, on that north field, auditorium, wonderful. But it's not time yet. We are committed to not being so strapped financially that we're strapped to the wall, house poor, and can't do the very thing God's called us to do, make, baptize, and teach disciples. But because we can't do that now doesn't mean we can't do anything. And so that first step is spiritual growth, facing outward, and making our facilities reflect the church that we are right now. So we are going to be building a ministry center. Again, next week, more detail on that. We cannot build an auditorium until we can park our cars, train our children, pastor our people. So we want to make sure we're in a good position to do that before we try and do something even much larger. So let me answer this question. What am I asking you to do? What is it, Scott, you're looking for from us as members or regular attenders of Crossroads Community Church? There are 3. The first is this. Vision fuels growth. I invite you to walk with us along this path. Vision fuels growth. I ask you to walk with us along this path. I want you to see what God has done and what He can do in your life, and through your commitments to spiritual growth and your commitments to this church, what God can do in the life of this community. I want you to take a look at this video. This is Brock and Aaron Edwards as they talk about the vision they have for what God could do here.
We are Brock and Aaron Edwards, and we've been coming to Crossroads for about 3 years with our son Hudson, who is now 8 months old.
A defining moment in our lives at this church is we both were baptized last year. We found that it was really important that we were to take ownership and claim of our faith and to actually do that as adults. So that was really big for us.
Mm-hmm. And it was really after we got married, we got connected to Crossroads, that we felt like we were claiming our faith as our own. And so to be baptized and to stand in front of the church and to affirm that this was the personal choice, this was the choice that we were making, and to say that to our new church family.
What excites me about Crossroads is just to continually see all the growth that's happening. I mean, since even in the last year, all the expansion that we've done, there's been so many people. We've added a Saturday night service, and I know that Scott said that 2017 is going to be a time where we're going to take risks and we're going to continue to grow. And so I'm just really excited to see more people come into this church and just learn about Jesus.
I think one way that the church really values families is by building a whole children's wing, by really emphasizing the importance of parents. Scott preaching to moms and to dads, and knowing that Hudson is growing up in a place that he's going to be taught the word just like we are when we're sitting in church.
They make sure that whether it's Pastor Scott or Pastor Nate or Austin, when they're preaching, that they actually speak to parents, and they'll actually say, parents in the audience, how would you handle this situation? This is what the scriptures say about how you should foster your family and your kids, and husbands to your wives and wives to your husbands. And so I see that there's just a real emphasis on speaking directly to parents.
One of the reasons that we give to Crossroads, it's just given so much to us. Through small groups, through the preaching that we receive, through the support that we have with friends that we've made here. And we really believe in the mission of this church to make, baptize, and teach disciples, to support missions here and abroad.
We not only take time to pray for the different missions that are either abroad or local, whether it's in Papua New Guinea or Ghana or Nigeria or here locally. We're constantly praying for them. We're constantly providing for them financially, and we're also visiting them. I know that this year is the first year that we had a whole team that actually went and helped and built up pastors to actually reach their communities. And so I see that in a lot of different ways that we're really honoring and emphasizing that.
I think that one of the ways that God has been teaching us to live generously is really through Brock's leadership of our family in the way that we give. From when we were dating, when we were engaged, he was very faithful about tithing. And I think that he does it so joyfully, and it really makes me joyful in doing that too.
If I was speaking to someone and encouraging them to give, whether it's their time or financially, or I would just ask them to really look inside their heart and and look at all the good things in your life and really be thankful for what you have. And then just to remember that God gave you everything. All of the good things that you have in your life, God gave that to you. And God can do way better things with what you have than what you can do with it. And just, if you give it, it's freeing. And just to see what God is going to do with that, it's so powerful. And I think at the same time, it really builds spiritual maturity, and that you're saying to God that I'm not just here on this earth to receive your goodness. I'm here to share your goodness with other people.
All right, Brock and Aaron, did I see you this service? Hey, all right, thank you for that. Appreciate that. I noticed how often it came up. I see, or we can see this happen. Again, vision drives that growth. See what it is God has called you to be and to do. Pursue that and recognize that when you have clarity on that, it really does drive growth in your life spiritually. So, I would say to you that vision drives growth, it fuels it. Walk with us along this journey. Join us in this. Second, effort brings growth. Take the next step on your journey. Effort brings growth. Take the next step on your personal journey. Listen, we are inviting you to make a commitment to grow spiritually over the next 2 years. I recognize we all begin this journey at different places, and likely we will end it at different places as well. What I'm asking you to do is not to dedicate yourself to become a spiritual giant overnight. That never happens. But you and I can take the next step. When Vicki and I left Mishawaka, Indiana, and drove to the western suburbs of Chicago, I had no idea where that would take us. We just took the next step. Let me just define some of those steps. For some of you, Sunday morning worship on a regular basis needs to be the next step. Some of you need to say, listen, we're going to be here the next 4 weeks. In fact, we're going to be here for the next 14 or 40 weeks. I would challenge you as part of spiritual growth to allow your schedule to flow around your Sunday morning or Saturday night commitment, not the reverse of that. Get locked in life on setting the time aside once a week to be with your Father who is in heaven, to be able to spend time singing songs to Him, hearing the Word of God preached, and participating in the life of the church, the corporate life of the church. That's a commitment. I would say for some of you, that's already a commitment. God bless you. Thank you. The next step may be, I'm going to engage at some level in relationship. I'm going to commit to being involved in a small group. I know Pastor Nate has some new small groups. They're going to be starting right now, this week. And so catch them at the Connect Desk afterwards. And for others, you say, you know what, I'm not ready for the small group thing, but I would love to serve. What great relationships you can build in serving in our ministry here. Again, stop by the Connect Desk, let us know. What I'm saying to you is commit to take the next step. Spiritual growth is not a passive activity. It requires for you and I to be clear on what God has called us to do, that's vision, and then making the effort to go forward. Listen, I will tell you, and I wish I had time to tell you more stories, the best stories are had by those that have made the effort to step forward. The folks in this congregation that are the most fearless in their faith are the ones that have taken those steps, often risk, often change, and in doing so, as they have stressed and stretched their faith, God has grown their faith and blessed them. Make the effort. Be intentional about taking steps of spiritual growth over these next 2 years. Third, faith sustains growth. Trust God to build your faith and to build our church. Faith sustains growth. Trust God to build your faith and our church. We must trust that when we are clear on what God is calling us to be and to do, and we make the effort to take those next steps of faith, we must trust, believe God will bless those efforts. Now, let me read you a New Testament story. It's 2 books over, Luke chapter 19. It's one of the defining moments of Jesus' ministry, and it once again illustrates the power of vision, of understanding that what God has called us to do calls for us to make specific steps of effort, and that God blesses those efforts. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. If you know anything about the Gospel of Luke, you recognize it's one of the greatest books ever written, and that the hinge is Luke 9:51, where Jesus said he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and all the rest of the book is simply his travel journey going from the north to Jerusalem, where he would lay down his life for the sins of the world. On the way, he interviews many people. He has all kinds of adventures. He does miracles. He teaches. But always, always, the marker is he's getting closer and closer to Jerusalem. When we get to Luke 19, he's in Jericho. It's the next city just outside Jerusalem. It's the closest suburb. 19:1, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. Again, the idea is, I'm on my way to Jerusalem. I am not stopping to do much. But there's one interruption in Jericho. There was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He would have been hated because he was a turncoat working with the hated Roman occupation. He collected their taxes. And he was very rich. Having done that, he was not a popular man in Jericho. And he was seeking to see Jesus, who Jesus was. Interesting, this particular narrative is about Zacchaeus seeking Jesus, and in reality, it's Jesus who's seeking him. And he was seeking to see Jesus, who Jesus was, but could not on account of the crowd. He was of small stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him. How many of you right now, that children's church song is running through your mind? You know that? Zacchaeus was a wee little... Oh, that's weak. I thought I was a bad singer. All right, so some of you, I was asking some of the students last night, like, no, I never heard of that song. It's like, who ever heard of that song? And so that's what's going on. He climbed up into the sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. In verse 5, when Jesus came to the place, he looked up. Isn't it interesting? It's Zacchaeus thinking he's looking for Jesus, when all along it was Jesus who looked up and said, hey, I've got something to deal with you today. And I've got underlined in my Bible, Zacchaeus, Jesus said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down. I must, that's the word, isn't it interesting? I'm on my way to Jerusalem to complete a worldwide task, but I must stay at your house tonight. Jesus never lost sight of the fact God had sent him to sacrifice for the sins of the world. And that sacrifice was made individually, one at a time. So Zacchaeus hurried and came down and received him joyfully. I love that. He welcomed him into his house. And in that receiving Jesus joyfully, transformation took place. Look at Zacchaeus' response. Verse 7, when they saw it, that is the crowd, they all grumbled. He has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Right? So Jesus is going to be living with sinner this night. What's that all about? And I love Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus stood and he said, Lord, behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. What's he saying? Lord, your mission in my life has transformed me. And where I used to take, now I'm willing to give, and I'll be honest and upright in my dealings. And look at Jesus' response. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, since he also is the son of Abraham. It's interesting, he didn't say today salvation has come to this house because he gave his money away. It's not about that. Listen, when God gets your heart, he's got your wallet. I'm not worried about that. Zacchaeus experienced the life-changing power of a relationship with Jesus Christ, brought joy, brought generosity, and Jesus said, the best thing about this whole thing, he's now a part of the family. This man is a child of Abraham. Look at verse 10. Here's what Jesus never lost sight of with the mission. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. You and I have to enter into these next 4 weeks, and by extension this next 2 years of spiritual growth, convinced that God has called us to do and be this thing, that God blesses the efforts that we put forth, and that there will be a benefit that we will have. So let me illustrate it this way. I began this message by telling you about my experience 21 years ago when we left home and we came here. And over the years, I have been collecting cards that people have sent me. Always so appreciative. This is, I'm not sure what. It's got a feather and a frog, so how do you beat that? And this is from Dylan. Dylan's family will be in our 11 o'clock service. And again, a frog and a firefly and puffballs. And not sure what all that means, but I think it's good. And we didn't know what would happen when we took that step of faith and risk. We just had hoped and prayed that we might have a chance to connect with some people. And we began to receive cards of how God has done work in people's lives. And I saved them because it's good reading on a Monday. And we received cards about how God has changed lives, how families have been impacted, and to receive cards about how during difficult times the ministry stood with people, helped them get through that, and receive cards of people who've lost children, lost parents, and how God's grace has been sufficient for them, and receive cards about the steps of faith that people have taken, and how God in doing that has grown them, and how they've never seen God not come through for them. And we've seen cards of encouragement and help and hope for the ministry that we've provided. And this one's called Personal, for very personal notes of what God has done in our lives. And that's what we're building. Give yourself to this. 21 years from now, written in the hearts and maybe in the notes from people, will be those who say, thank God you took risks. You faced change. My life is different because of that. That credit goes to God, but it also goes to those who are willing to be the instrument, the tools that God will use to make, to baptize, and to teach disciples. It is worth it. Be a part of it.